this talk, I will discuss my PhD work on the numerical model of shallow slow slip events along the Hikurangi margin. So this work was done alongside my supervisors Yoshihiro Kaneko and Martha Savage, and the collaborators that I list here. So the Hikurangi margin is very interesting in terms of slow slip because they show a rich diversity of characteristics. So for instance, they occur at both shallow and deep depths. So the shallow Hikurangi SSEs occur offshore the east coast of the North Island, and they occur at less than 15-kilometer depths, whereas the deep events occur between 20 and 50 kilometers. So these events also show contrasting source properties. Shallow Hikurangi SSEs are usually of short duration, between 2 to 3 weeks, and low magnitudes, whereas deep Hikurangi SSEs have much longer durations, between 1 and 2 years, and larger magnitudes. There are several characteristics that describe the environment where slow slip events occur along Hikurangi. For instance, the interseismic coupling changes along the strike of the margin. So in this figure, I show the coupling coefficient, where blue indicates low coupling and red high coupling. So we see that there's a transition from low coupling in the northern part of the margin to strongly coupled in the south. And it's interesting to note that slow slip events occur close to the transition between low coupling and light coupling, both shallow and deep events. Another important characteristic is that pore-pressure at the source depths of these events is high. So I'm showing here a profile of the subduction zone at this line, and they have inferred that there's an elevated pore fluid pressure close to the plate interface, and not only that, but that the fault is also very rough in those plates at that plate boundary, because they have detected seamounts and also lithological and frictional heterogeneities at the plate interface. So all this is to say that the environment where slow slip events occur along Hikurangi is very complex, and that these events are maybe influenced by different factors. So the motivation for our simulations is to is based on two observations made on shallow Hikurangi SSEs. The first one indicates that the recurrence intervals of these events changes along the Hikurangi margin based on geodetic observations. And the second was a study that showed that pore fluid pressure cyclically varied during shallow Hikurangi SSEs. So I divided my talk in two parts, where I explain how I use numerical simulations to try to understand the mechanism behind each of these two observations. So starting with part one, I discussed the modeling of the segmentation of shallow Hikurangi SSEs. So in this figure, I show the gradient of the continuous GPS displacements along the East Coast. So the y-axis show the distance along strike, and the x-axis is the time. So the darker color regions indicate periods of slow slip. So what these observations show is that these events are more frequent in the northern part of the margin, where they recur every 2 years, and the recurrence interval increases southwards. So they recur every 1 to 2 years in the central part of the margin, and approximately every 5 years in the south. So similar observations have been reported in other subduction zones, such as Cascadia and Nankai. And there are several factors that have been proposed to explain them, but it's not clear what is the governing factor behind the segmentations along Hikurangi. So to address this question, we conduct numerical simulations using the simulation code developed by Duo Li and Yayin Liu. I know Duo presented recently, so I'll just briefly describe their approach. This code is governed by two equations, mainly the quasi-dynamic relation from Rice 1993 that relates the shear stress with the fault slip, and the rate and state friction law. Just to note that we use the aging law for the evolution of the state variable. So moving on to the model setup, we consider a 3D plate interface where we define the distribution of two important variables, which are the friction coefficient, friction parameter, which is determined by A minus B from the rate and state friction. So we assume that the region where slow sleep events occur is rate weakening, and it is the behavior is rate strengthening up, outside that region. And based on inferences from geodetic observations, we assume high pore pressures or equivalently low effective normal stresses between 1 and 10 megapascals at the source depths of slow sleep events. And for simplicity, we set it to be 50 megapascals outside. There are also some bands on both of the upper and lower ends of the model geometry. These are just parametrizations to model the coupling conditions at those parts of the margin. We also consider that the plate rate increases northward along the margin, as shown here by the red arrows. So one important parameter of this modeling approach is the effective fold stiffness ratio, W over H star. In this case, W measures the down dip distance of the region with rate weakening conditions under low effective normal stress. So in this figure, I show the change in W along the margin. And we see that it is very narrow in the northern part of the margin and wide in the south. And this change is mainly due to the change in the fold in the deep angle of the plate interface that is much shallower in the southern part of the margin than in the northern part. So this will be an important change to be considered in the modeling. So in this ratio, H star represents the nucleation size, which we take from definition of Rubin and Ampuero, 2005. So I mentioned that this parameter is key because previous studies have found that when this ratio is close to unity, it is more likely that SSEs arise. So to find the model parameter that explains the observations, we explore these two parameters, A over B and the effective fold stiffness ratio within the slow sleep region. So each simulation takes between half a day to 2 days using 53 physical cores. And these are some of the results. So we find different sleep behaviors from stable creep to instabilities and SSEs in between. It is interesting that even though most of the simulations led to SSEs, they didn't arise in the whole margin as the observations indicate, but only in certain parts. So the simulations that are here encircled are the ones that were comparable with observations in that SSEs arose along the whole margin. So from these circled simulations, we selected a best model that reproduced the properties of shallow Hikurangi SSEs. So in this figure, I'm comparing some of the source properties, duration, magnitude, maximum sleep, and maximum sleep rate between the observations, which are the gray bars, and the modeled, which are the box plots. This is just to show that the model broadly reproduces the observed ranges. So I will show now a movie of the representative model. So this is a movie in log that shows the sleep velocity on the fold in log scale. And red is above the plate rate and blue is below the plate rate. So let's close it. So we see that it starts with slow sleep nucleating in Mahia Peninsula and another one nucleating offshore Gisborne. And also it's interesting to know that the sleep fronts migrate all along the margin during these events. Oh. So this patchy nucleation of slow sleep events in that they occur at different parts of the margin over time, it's also consistent with observations. So to understand the evolution of the sleep rate on the fold, I plot here the sleep rate at 10-kilometer depth over 100 years. So this is for the representative model. And we see that SSEs arise as the brown stripes. So we see that they arise periodically and that the period changes along the strike of the margin. So to quantify that change, we calculate the period is the recurrence interval at these 3 points along the margin, and we show the results here. So the model shows that the slow sleep events are more frequent in the northern part of the margin at P1 and they are less frequent in the south. So this broadly coincides with the observations. However, we still don't know why this behavior is happening. So to address that question, we conduct additional simulations in which we isolate the effect of the plate geometry and the plate convergence rate. So apart from the non-planar fold, we consider then a planar fold. So the main difference between the two is that W is constant for the planar fold. And we also consider simulations in which we applied both a uniform and a variable plate rate to see the effect of removing this change. So for each simulation that we conducted, we measure the recurrence interval of the SSEs that emerge at these 3 points along the margin. So the results of these changes are seen here. So we see that the main thing we found was that there was an increase in SSE segmentation when we added more complexity to the model. For instance, in the model with non-planar geometry, we found that a variable plate convergence rate led to more segmented SSEs, whereas the model with a planar geometry and a constant uniform plate rate along the margin led to a a uniform recurrence interval. So our simulations indicate that these changes of the SSE recurrence intervals can be correlated with changes in these effective stiffness ratio, in that the SSEs that are more frequent occur in the northern part of the margin where W is narrower, and the SSEs that are less frequent correlate with the region where the SSE source region, or W, is larger. And this segmentation is also enhanced by the along strike change in the plate rate. So to conclude for this first part, we found that a model that is relatively simple in that we do not include frictional heterogeneities along strike could reproduce the main properties of observed shallow SSEs in Hikurangi. And also the segmentation of the recurrence intervals of these events is controlled by along strike changes in the fold effective stiffness ratio, and also the plate rate. There are several limitations of this model. As I mentioned, the parameter range that leads to SSEs comparable to observations is relatively narrow. The model also assumes a constant pore fluid pressure over time, which, as I will explain later, is not consistent with observations. And we assume a uniform friction conditions in the source region of SSEs, which is also not the case, as there is also race strengthening behavior in those regions. So some of these limitations of this model will be addressed in the next model, in which I model the pore fluid pressure fluctuations that have been inferred during shallow Hikurangi SSEs. So this comes from recent studies that indicate pore fluid pressure changes correlate with SSEs. So these can be explained in this schematic diagram. If we see that SSEs are represented by the yellow stripes, observations indicate that pore fluid pressure peaks before the SSE and it drops after the event. And this occurs cyclically following the occurrence of slow slip events. So this figure shows an example diagram that represents the conceptual model behind the potential mechanism of this pore fluid pressure fluctuation. So according to this interpretation, before slow slip events, the plate interspace would be sealed, and this causes accumulation of fluids in the lower plate, thus building overpressure. So eventually, this overpressure would induce slip on the plate interface, and these I show here by the these contours that are an example of a Gisborne SSE. And the slip of this induced event would create open fractures that would allow the fluid migration from the lower plate to the upper plate, and then decreasing the pore fluid pressure in the lower plate. So our idea was to try to test these conceptual model using simulations, and our modeling approach is motivated by recent studies that show that pore pressure changes on a rate strengthening fault zone lead to aseismic slip. So this is an example from a model by Yang and Dunham 2021, where they find that the pressurized region in a rate strengthening fault zone hosts aseismic slip. And these results are interesting because they suggest that if aseismic slip could be hosted in rate strengthening faults, it's probable that slow slip events could also be hosted. So based on this, motivated by these previous models, we investigate this modeling approach in which periodic perturbations of pore fluid pressure are imposed on rate strengthening faults. So to do that, we use the model developed by Lapusta and Liu 2009. So these models assume a planar fault that is governed by rate and state friction, and we impose periodic changes in pore fluid pressure at the center of the fault. So these changes are applied by varying the effective normal stress. And this is a relatively simple approach in that we do not account for porosity or permeability evolution as previous models. Here I show some of the important parameters of the simulations that I will present. So we focus exclusively on rate strengthening faults. We assume a background effective stress of 3 megapascals, which is relatively low, but it's due to computational costs. And the size of the characteristic process zone is set to be 4 kilometers. So to model the pore fluid pressure perturbation, we define 2 different shapes. So the first one we call the sawtooth perturbation, in which is motivated by the inferred pore pressure cycle in along Hikurangi during shallow SSEs. So this perturbation has this sawtooth shape in that pore fluid pressure steadily increases and then it suddenly drops after a certain time. For simplicity, we assume this perturbation has a Gaussian distribution in space. So the second perturbation we model it as driven by fluid diffusion. So fluids are, so to say, injected at the center of the fault and they diffuse radially from the injection point. And to model this diffusion, we use the analytical solution of the diffusion equation. So important parameters to consider here are the hydraulic diffusivity D and the injection time, which is actually the time that the fluid will be flowing into the fault. So I will present now some of the model results. First, mention that the simulations take between 1 to 10 hours to run using 64 physical cores, and we find that SSEs emerge during pore fluid pressure increase. And after conducting a parameter exploration, we were able to find 2 representative models that reproduce the properties of shallow Gisborne SSEs. which are the ones that occur in this part of the margin. So in the next slides, I will explain the fault response for these two representative models. So I'll start by defining the imposed perturbation. So for the first type of perturbation, we assume a pore pressure change of 2 megapascals and a radius of the perturbation of 30 kilometers, which is approximately the radius of the length scale of SSEs along Hikurangi. So we know that the period of the perturbation is about 2 years because that's approximately the recurrence interval of shallow Gisborne SSEs. So the blue lines here represent the maximum slip on the fold normalized with respect to the plate rate. So what we see is that the slip velocity increases during pore pressure increase, and they increase about above 3 orders of magnitude above the plate rate, which are velocities comparable to SSEs events. For the next perturbation, we assume fluid are injected at the center of the fold over 30 days. And the maximum for pressure change is about half the background stress, 1.5 megapascals. And we assume a very large diffusivity of 50 meters squares per second. And again, in this case, we find that there are transient increases in the maximum velocity on the fold. So for both of these models, we calculated the source properties, duration, magnitude, maximum slip, and recurrence time, and we find that they are within the ranges of the observed shallow Gisborne SSE properties. So I will present now briefly the evolution of the slip rate on the fold during this event, starting with the first representative model for type 1 perturbation. Again, this is a log scale of the slip rate on the fold normalized with respect to the plate rate, where red is above the plate rate and blue is below the plate rate. So in this case, slip acceleration starts at the edges of the applied perturbation and it migrates inwards. It reaches a peak velocity at the center of the fold and then it propagates outwards. And it's interesting that after the event, the fold remains fully locked. For the second type of perturbation, just play the movie. So the slip acceleration starts at the center of the fold and then it expands in a crack. After pore fluid pressure, once the fluid flow stops, the fold starts, sorry, I'm going to play that part again. So once fluid flow, the fold starts locking at the center, and while the crack expansion continues until finally the slip acceleration just drops. And the fold is again locked in the period between slow slip events. So once we found these models, we wondered that whether our modeling approach could reproduce broader SSE properties. And to test that, we explored a broader range of parameters of the perturbation, of the second type of perturbation, the diffusion-driven one. And we found that this perturbation is characterized by its characteristic size, which is given by the combination of these parameters shown here, where these the hydraulic diffusivity, this is the injection time, where you time the fluid flows into the fold, and LB is the critical length scale of the process zone, which we assume constant with the simulations. So we explore a wider range for the injection time and the diffusivity, and we impose perturbation with different characteristic size of the perturbation, and for each perturbation we calculated the properties of the induced SSEs, and we plot the results in this figure. So here it shows the duration and moment of the induced SSE with respect to the characteristic size of the perturbation. So the main thing to note is that the model reproduced a broad range of SSE properties, ranges from months to years, and also covering several orders, two orders of magnitude two orders of magnitude for the moment. Another thing is that by these properties of duration and moment increased with increasing size of the perturbation length scale. However, these results have a caveat, and is that we have to assume hydraulic diffusivities between 0.1 and 100 meters squares per second, which are several orders of magnitude higher than estimates from lab and in situ measurements. So we wanted to test whether, given that the model could reproduce a broad range of properties, whether we could reproduce observed SSEs, durations, and moments. And we selected target SSEs, both long-term and short-term events. For long-term, we include deep Hikurangi SSEs, Nankai SSEs, and Guerrero SSEs in Mexico. And for short-term, we include Cascadia and the shallow Hikurangi SSEs for comparison. So what we found was that if we varied the characteristic size of the perturbation, we could find the parameter space that could broadly reproduce the observed ranges. So I must also note here that this does not only depend on the characteristic size of the perturbation, but also on the recurrence interval of the period of the perturbation, which we assumed is corresponds to the recurrence interval of the SSEs at the different subduction zones. So just to conclude this second part, we found models that could reproduce the source property of shallow Hikurangi SSEs by assuming periodic perturbations in pore-pressure on a rate strengthening fault. Our model indicates that the SSE moment and duration depend on the perturbation length scale, and by varying this parameter, we could find models that could reproduce a broad range of SSE properties from different subduction zones. So these results suggest that periodic pore-pressure perturbations in a rate strengthening fault zone may be a viable mechanism to generate SSEs. This modeling approach is not constrained by the effective fault stiffness ratio that, as I mentioned in the part one of this talk, is a drive-in parameter for SSE generation in rate weakening friction conditions.